Hello, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. Just click on the YouTube icon in the upper right-hand corner. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm just delighted to welcome this morning's guest. Ken Turino is here. He's Manager of Community Partnerships and Resource Development at Historic New England, and he's published numerous articles on the history of Christmas and has a book in development on the topic. Ken, welcome and thank you for visiting the morning show.
Thank you, Mary. I'm delighted to be here.
My pleasure, especially since I've had the pleasure of hearing your talk on this subject through Historic New England's online offerings. And one of the many things that I enjoyed was your focus on Christmas as a constantly evolving holiday, both in its relative importance as a holiday, as well as in the ways that it's been celebrated over the years. You know, for me anyway, I think I often tend to think of my personal memories of Christmas as the way it's always been, instead of Christmas reflecting traditions that are kind of always moving on the rivers of time and social and economic and religious trends. So I'm curious to find out, Ken, as you began researching the past 400 years of Christmas celebrations in New England, what surprised you the most about Christmases past and how they're different from our contemporary celebrations?
Well, that's a really great question, Mary. And I have thought about that a lot because I think I came from the same way as you did in terms of that, the customs, traditions that we have today, I assumed were age old. And doing my research, I found that that's really not true. Some of them are much more recent than we think. And as you said, they continue to evolve and change to this day. I think in creating the Christmas that we have today, we drew from various cultures to create what we have. And also we invented what we said were traditions, but we actually invented them in America. And I think that continues to evolve and change over time. So I think that's the main thing that struck me.
Yeah. Yeah, well, one of the things that struck me as I was listening to your talk, and you went back to the beginning, well, at least 400 years ago, was that Christmas appeared to have two different strains of celebration that were in tension, perhaps even contradiction with one another. One was these really, really rowdy feasts and lots of drinking and even mayhem. And the other kind of extreme or contrary to that was the Puritans, very austere kind of shunning of Christmas. So let's talk about the rowdy revelers first. You talked about them as mummers, and I was curious about what traditions they represented, what countries they came from, and what they did. And then also you talked about, it just got my attention, the Lord of Misrule. So please tell us about that part of the tension between how Christmas has been celebrated first.
Happy to. And if it's okay, I will show you just a few images I brought.
That would be wonderful. Just wonderful, Ken.
There we go. Let's get this up here for you. You can see this.
Yes, absolutely. It's a motley crew
it is
around a punch bowl.
So there's, I focus in my talk on New England traditions. And I want to step back for just a second and remind people that we had other traditions here in early America because we had the Spanish in California, New Mexico, and Texas that brought with them really celebrations that were tied to the Catholic Church. And very, very different than what was happening in, say, England. And even with the English settlers, New England differed to what was going on in the southern colonies. So there are a lot, and this is again that mixing. So what you're looking at now is what would be a scene in maybe down south, Virginia. And in my research, I've looked at lots of diaries and records of these celebrations, and in England. And what happened was that a lot of the traditions in England, and they were drawing some from Europe too, did go back in time And, there's indication that, the church in England, especially, and other parts of Europe was trying to mingle some of the pagan customs and make them meld with the Catholic Church. Going back, this is the season where we celebrate, light. The solstice is coming. The Saturnalia was a pagan ceremony. So a lot of the English traditions actually had to do with lots and lots of drinking, begging, singing, songs, rowdiness. And you see that in the illustrations, you see that in the record of the time too. And you can see that in other images like the mummers here. And the mummers, what they did, they dress in costume while merrymaking or taking part in a pantomime. Now, the mummers tradition, actually, there is a tradition that continues in America with the mummers parade, New Year's, and Philadelphia. And if you've ever attended it, it is one big drunk. I mean, it's like Mardi Gras, but it's that tradition. Now, in New England, well, I should say also, you asked specifically about the Lord of Misrule. And this was a time in England with these earlier celebrations. What happened was, they sort of inverted the social order. So those near the bottom of the social order might act high and mighty. Young people might mock their elders, imitate them, and become Lord of Misrule that you see here. And the Lord of Misrule would be the ruler and mimic the authority of a real gentleman. Now, these were taking place in England, and it was this that Cromwell and the Puritans in England were reacting against. And then when Cromwell takes power, he outlawed the observance of Christmas. Not very successfully, but he did. And he held Parliament on Christmas for a number of years to strengthen that. But again, not everyone was adhering to this. Now, when you get to New England, the Puritans were largely successful in suppressing Christmas. They really were.
Well, what did the Puritans have against Christmas, Ken?
Well, this rowdiness, this singing of songs, exchanging gifts for goodwill, dancing, songs, feasting, begging, and lots of drinking. This was anathema to the Puritans. But we also have to remember that not everyone who came over with the Puritans was a Puritan believer, too. But that feeling did take root in New England. Again, the South was more of the Anglican settlers who, 12 days of Christmas, seeing friends and partying was more the norm. And some of the English traditions took root there where they didn't really take root here in New England.
Yeah, I'm from Virginia, and so I know, there were the Cavaliers, not Puritans by any stretch of the imagination. But Ken, I'm so intrigued at this idea of the Lord of Misrule and this intriguing idea of the social inversion. So those were on the bottom rung were, for a day anyway, on the top, and those on the top sort of lost some of their privileges. And I'm curious, do you know, what is this grounded in? Do you know where this a connection between this idea of a hierarchical inversion, how that got connected with Christmas?
Well, that is actually another really, really good and thoughtful question. And, that goes more to the European tradition, which is interesting because it does go back in time, but this was a time where, the harvest comes in.
Yeah.
People are feasting, they're celebrating. And this was the opportunity for them, for this one period, for those near the bottom rung, they were given gifts. They were given food, songs, and there are accounts of this. And it's really interesting, Mary, because I'm doing some research I'm reading a great book called Yuletide in Dixie. And with the enslaved in the South, it was typically a period where people The enslaved were given their clothes. This was not universal. They may have been given a day off. It could have been a week. It really depended, but it was a time. And that, again, is coming from some of this English and Southern traditions, which stayed. It's really, really fascinating. So it does have its root in antiquity.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it also occurs to me that is sort of if we get back to the kind of the religious roots of the Christ story, Christ is the King of Kings, but he's born in a manger. And so there's kind of a social inversion of power inherent in the very story that you have this infant, being born with the farm animals in the manger, and yet the three wise men are coming to give gifts to the King of Kings. So it kind of makes sense in that context as well. Well, Ken, thanks for that. This is all so fascinating. And again, so eye-opening. Christmas wasn't just the way it was when I was growing up.
Well, the one no, the one other thing I'll mention is that the Puritans were totally against that excessive drinking and partying, but also they kept pointing to the fact that the Bible does not say December 25th was Christ's
Yeah,
birthday, does not give an exact date. And they
yeah.
were adamant against that. You found that in sermons and in books and so on.
Yeah. Okay. So there was no official authority to call upon. Well, speaking of the Puritans again, of course, Cromwell got removed from power. And you mentioned in your talk that everything changed then after Cromwell was no longer in power. So could you say a little bit about how things did they change back, or was there something new that came into place with Christmas after Cromwell was gone?
Well, what happens before Cromwell leaves is that Christmas actually gets outlawed in Massachusetts in 1659 by the General Court, and that people were fined 5 shillings if they kept Christmas. And I found records in the courts, the Salem Quarterly Court, of people who were arrested for, quote, suffering tippling in their house by those who came to keep Christmas. So that's what's happening. So when Cromwell is out of power, the monarchy comes back in, and that ban for Christmas gets repealed in 1681. Now, because it was obnoxious, the law to the monarchy, they were going back to the older celebrations, which had never really totally died out. They hadn't. They had just been suppressed in England. So it's only slowly from there that the Christmas traditions here in New England start to develop.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I know it's also, given our Christmas festivities today, it's always surprising to find that Christmas was just a normal work day for centuries. That,
I've done a lot of research in diaries, and people will know Christmas, and then they're going off to work, and it was a regular school day too. Let's not forget that. So yes, it was.
yeah. So kind of like, just like Flag Day, maybe. Not the big deal it is today. But I think you said that things began to change later in the 17th century, if I have my dates right, and correct me if I don't. And you mentioned a shift in attitudes, that you gave the example of the trial of Father Christmas and Mr. Give Little as examples of that shift in attitude. So I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about those.
Oh yes, I can, and that is tied into, here we have the trial of Father Christmas. Christmas was still debated throughout the 18th century. This is actually from the late 17th century, and it's mocking the Puritans, who were now out of power. But what happened is they're putting Father Christmas, and this is in England, on trial. And the Puritan jurors bore such wonderful names you just mentioned, as Mr. Cold Kitchen, Mr. Hate Good, and Mr. Give Little. So once the law gets repealed here in Massachusetts, I mean, it wasn't just Massachusetts. There was a law against Christmas in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It was throughout a good portion of New England that it was actually outlawed for a while in the 17th century and then into the 18th century. And it's things like this, and in sermons and in pamphlets where people were promoting Christmas. And that's where you get this publication.
Mm-hmm.
But the Puritans, were highly successful here in New England. It stuck for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
and it just did. But slowly over time, you start to see more and more religious denominations having a service on Christmas Day.
Mm-hmm.
Still might have been a
Yeah.
work day, but they were having services. So it's a gradual change in the 18th century. It's a very much a gradual change.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the other things you talked about, Ken, in your talk was a tradition of begging for gifts. And you mentioned that a little bit before, but I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about the tradition of begging for gifts. And was that the foundation? I mean, there's such an emphasis today on gift giving. And do
Right.
you see that as the foundation for today's kind of hyper focus actually on gift giving? Um, uh, uh, so anyway, I was hoping you could fill us in a little bit on what that looked like in the past, and do you think it's how our gift giving evolved into the big deal that it is today?
Yeah, one of the things I talk about in my talk is, the traditions and when they come in. And one of the oldest that we do have, and this was also true of the South as it was here in New England, and that had to do with begging or asking for tips. And I have this wonderful broadside from the 1770s. The broadside's a poster for the Massachusetts Spy, which was a newspaper, and it's an advertisement for the giving tips to the newspaper boys. And it says, there's one stanza, I think I have it by heart. Kind sirs, your generous bounty flow, few shillings on your lad bestow. And it's asking for tips. So that is part of the English tradition. And that I found many ads. I also found one for lamplighters, a poster from the 18th century asking at Christmas to give them a tip. So that does relate to the earliest kind of gift giving. And it's really interesting because we talk about the commercialization of Christmas today. And in my research, I've been doing for like over 30 years, I have to tell you, as Christmas develops in our country, with the Christmas tree, with Santa Claus, gift giving was commercialized from the beginning. I have ads from 1806 from Salem, Massachusetts papers advertising for Christmas and New Year's gifts. Now, I should say, in the early 19th century, New Year's was equated with gift giving as much as Christmas.
Oh.
And that's really interesting because that's still the biggest holiday in Russia as opposed to Christmas. Christmas was actually outlawed in Russia until 1991.
Oh, okay.
That's not that long ago.
No, it's not.
It wasn't taken off the books. New Year's, it's not that people didn't celebrate, but it was still on the books. But New Year's was the Russian big holiday. Here in America, it was equated with Christmas, and eventually New Year's fell away and Christmas rose up to be the big gift giving.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. I'd never heard that before.
Yeah. So there, the gift giving is intermingled with the begging. It
Yeah.
comes from that.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because I've actually traveled to Japan 4 times at Christmas time. And each time, with a few years in between, I've seen Christmas grow and grow there. I mean, like it's everywhere. And the Japanese particularly love it because they love exchanging gifts. So it ties into that aspect, ties into their culture. So it's interesting how other cultures have taken our American Christmas and are transforming it. It's also a date night. Christmas is a big date night in Japan. Really, really interesting.
Well, it is really interesting, and it kind of comes full circle then, because one of the things that you talked about, and I was hoping you would tell us about now, is the impact as other cultural and ethnic groups began moving into the United States. They brought their own Christmas traditions with them, which we incorporated so that often I think we don't realize that some of our traditions, they're not homegrown. They're
Right.
part of the melting pot of traditions. But could you talk a little bit about, I think, particularly in the 19th century, when there was such an influx of immigrants from many different countries, about how those imported traditions impacted the way Christmas was celebrated?
And, absolutely. So you're right. What happened in the 19th century, more and more immigrant groups came into America, and it's really through the German immigrants, particularly in Pennsylvania, that we have the Christmas tree, bringing that tradition over. Now, it starts out in the late 18th century in Germany as just a regional practice, and by 1800 it becomes pretty much nationwide, and we're having immigrants coming in. So the earliest known tree image we have of a tree was done in the Pennsylvania countryside between 1812 and 1819.
Hmm.
So that's an example of, one, and I can go back and talk more about the Christmas tree later, but also let's talk, for example, like the Christmas stocking. That is actually an adaptation of both a Dutch and Italian ritual.
Hmm.
Okay, so you see how we're drawing from different traditions and different cultures. Santa Claus, which I know we'll talk a little bit more
Yeah.
about, was actually an invented tradition, but we'll
Hmm.
save that. But it did draw from other cultures. And I think one way, and that I don't really talk too much about in the lecture, but a lot of people still, the traditions that they brought from their homeland that exist the most are the foodways and what
Yeah.
they make and cook as part of their traditional holiday festivities. And I know that that's part of my tradition, and we can talk more about that later. So yes, we are drawing, and the Christmas card, for example, that was developed first in England in the 1840s, and then who is it but a German printer in Boston who popularizes it in America? So again, we're drawing these things. It's the poinsettia, for example. That was a wild plant in Mexico that Joel R. Poinsett, obviously named after him, brings to, he was the ambassador to Mexico, brings it back to California. It starts growing in greenhouses in the 1830s, but it doesn't really become popular until the 1870s throughout the country. When you can get it, it was mostly grown in greenhouses, and they had to cultivate it because it used to be long and stringy, and it was a cut flower, not something that you grew. So see how these things are coming in from
Yeah.
different areas to make what we now consider our Christmas.
They do. They come from everywhere. I was amazed to learn that the poinsettias, came from Mexico. So they come in from everywhere, and then they form this really a melting pot of Christmas traditions. But we lose track then with their origins. And so I think thank you for bringing us back in touch with the family trees, so to speak, of these different traditions. And just to return to Christmas trees a little bit, because they grew in popularity, but I believe, Ken, they also grew in size as people began incorporating them into our celebrations. I believe you said they started, oh, here we have an example of a little one, a tabletop Christmas tree. But this
Yeah,
was,
yeah. It was really interesting to me because, and this is why New England played such a big role in promoting Christmas, because we were a major publication center, Boston particularly, and with the Christmas tree, most people in America, and that goes across all of America, read about Christmas trees before they actually saw them. And that was in the publications of the day, like Godey's Lady's Book or Harper. So they would read about them before seeing them. So
mm,
where did people actually see their first trees? Well, it was at a Sabbath school, and this is the image on the right is from a booklet from a Sabbath school,
mm,
or they would see, go to a church festival, and you can see that's a ticket from a church festival on the left. And that's where they first saw them, not not generally in their own house. And these early trees were set atop a table. And I want you to notice how they are cut. And I also want you to notice the gifts. So they were smaller than what we're used to, tabletop. And there's, some really wonderful, wonderful quotes that I have. Can I read you just one?
Yes, please do.
Okay, this was Joseph Kidder of Manchester, New Hampshire, wrote in his journal in 1851 about the decoration of the Christmas tree. Though the tree was thought scarcely more than a day, yet it grew as if by magic and bore fruit in abundance in its season. There were nearly 70 different articles suspended from its evergreen branches, making a very beautiful and attractive appearance. So that's what you're seeing here. This is, and I should say, this is actually the very first printed image we have of a Christmas tree in America. And it was printed in a gift book, which was a common form of gift, by a German immigrant, there's the Germans again, and published in Boston in 1836. And as Joseph Kidder said, the presents were generally hung from the tree. They were not wrapped. If they were too big for the tree, like you see a dollhouse there, they were placed on the table. If they were still too big, they would be placed on the floor. The gifts were not wrapped. And generally how you saw a Christmas tree, and I have some wonderful accounts of this, that they would be in a drawing room. The Christmas tree would be very freshly cut. You would have the gifts around. You would have real candles. You would also have a bucket of water or a bucket of sand next to it. The children would be outside. They would light the candles, open the door, and the kids would rush in like you see in this image to see the Christmas tree. And sometimes, the candles could be kept on a long time, other times not. But look how the tree is cut, and also very fresh. So different than our traditions, today. And what happens is that over the 19th century, the first one I mentioned that we have a visual representation is from 1812 to 1819. Towards the end of the 19th century, you then move to the floor to ceiling Christmas trees. That starts to become the norm. And here you see one. This is at the Upton's family home in Salem, Massachusetts. And Mary and I were talking before we went on air. Mary, this is now the House of Seven Gables. But the Uptons lived in it before it was a museum. And at the Gables, they've recreated this tree, which is quite lovely. But you see the difference here. Yeah, Christmas tree evolves over time too.
Absolutely. Well, and another prominent part of our Christmas, in addition to trees, of course, is Santa Claus. And I know he had his own evolution. Could you talk about the early stages of Claus and how we arrived at our rotund, reindeer chariot flying, bearded, red suited, jolly, sometimes coke huckstering Santa Claus of today, Ken?
I'm happy to. I'm putting up a couple of trade cards from our collection at Historic New England. These were cards that were given out by businesses. And I want you to look carefully at these. Santa Claus, has been said to be, an age-old tradition, but in reality, he's an invented tradition. St. Nicholas, his feast day is December 6th, so we just had that. And St. Nicholas, who was a bishop in Myra in what's modern day Turkey. I actually have visited his crypt in Turkey. Unfortunately, the Italians broke in and took his bones back to Italy, but the crypt's still there. He benefacted children, and that's how he sort of comes into the picture as being associated with children and giving gifts. And what happens is that the Knickerbockers in Washington Irving, in his Knickerbockers History of New York, actually has Santa as a character in several of his stories, and I have read them. And the Knickerbockers, which were the descendants of the Dutch, were really in New York. The rowdiness still persisted, and they were trying to calm things down. So they helped to promote this character, which, is an invented American tradition, but there are, some connections to Europe. But it's not clear what Santa's supposed to look like. And it's Clement Seymour in his 1823 publication, An Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas, that sort of puts Santa on everyone's radar. Now, that was published anonymously, and it's not till 1848 that he puts his name on it and illustrates it. So in the early years of Santa, and there are illustrations I found from 1821, even before Clement Seymour, that he's not, what he's supposed to look like is not set in stone. Look what he's wearing here, for example, and look at this Santa Claus. And he's young, he's tall, he's clean shaven, he's got wavy blonde hair, but over time, Santa's going to evolve. And
Santa gets fatter.
Santa gets fatter and less elf-like, less plebeian, as he's described by Clement Seymour. And it's Thomas Nast, the cartoonist, who does a series of images of Santa Claus, starting in the 1860s. And over those, Santa's at first not so tall, maybe rotund, but over time, Santa's going to become larger. And by this image of 1881, he set in stone what Santa's supposed to look like. That beard, look at those cheeks, the big belly, jolly, smoking his pipe. So it was from that time, 1881, that Santa gets, he gets set in stone. This is what we want. And his costume, no longer blue as you see here. It could be in many colors in the early illustrations. And sometimes Santa was young, sometimes he was old, evolves, and he becomes this. And I found a wonderful description from Concord, Mass. In 1853, describing his crimson uniform and his seemly hose and old-fashioned shoes and his vest. And it was really wonderful. So, eventually red gets, set as the color that Santa's supposed to be. So yes, he evolves over time until 1881. And I should mention, it's Thomas Nast who gives Santa a North Pole address. Because before that, in the literature, when I do this presentation, I like to ask people if they know where Santa lived. But in the literature, including the Washington Irving, he lived in Spain. Why not?
Go figure.
Good food, better food maybe, warmer climate, but he lived in Spain.
So it was Thomas Nast who sent him to the North Pole. You got to wonder how Santa felt about that.
Right.
Well, the Victorians, I believe, also, you talked about that they introduced some transformations, that era, to the celebration of Christmas. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the impact of the Victorian era on Christmas celebrations, Ken.
Well, that's a really another good question, Mary. Well, as I mentioned, Christmas, I'm mentioning dates, Christmas trees start appearing, but from 1810, and you've got, things come in, Christmas stocking pretty early on, because that's mentioned in Clement Seymour's poem and in earlier poems that I found. But it takes time to really evolve. And I'm gonna, if I could, I'd read you just one more quote. And
absolutely.
It's from the Victorian period. It's the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And I think it really is a great summary of what's still going on. He writes this on December 25th, 1856. And he writes, quote, "Not a very Merry Christmas. We are in a transition state here in New England. The old Puritan feeling prevents it from being a cheerful, hearty, holiday,
Mm.
though every year makes it so. So at the end, he notes
Mm.
it's changing. It's
Yeah.
starting to change. And
Yeah.
so that's really telling to me. So it continues to evolve over the 19th century, and then it evolves into a holiday for families and children. Historian Stephen Nissenbaum wrote, "Religion failed to transform Christmas from a season of misrule into a quieter pleasure. It was the religion of domesticity that
Mm.
would be represented at Christmas time. It was now a special time for children. And the Victorians weren't concerned just about the education and treating children as if they were just little adults, but now it was also for their happiness. And
Mm.
Christmas gets portrayed as a family-centered event. And again, the rowdiness still persisted throughout a good part of the country, well into the 19th century. And this was a way of combating that, making it
Yeah.
more of a domestic event.
Yeah. Yeah, and that certainly has stuck, which is how we currently view Christmas. But part of that Victorian transformation, I think, was Charles Dickens played a role in that, I believe, because he came to the U.S. I think you said it was the 1860s on a book tour for a Christmas Carol. Could you talk a little bit about the impact that had?
Yeah, that's another part. So we started talking a little bit about Christmas as being a family-centered event with your Christmas tree, your stockings, also very, very much the gift giving. And then on the other side of that, which comes in the Victorian era, that has to do with not thinking about just ourselves, but helping those less fortunate than ourselves. That becomes very common in the literature of the day. And where do we all think about that in particular? Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, right? And that's published, I believe that's the 1840s. But he comes and becomes hugely popular on both sides of the ocean, in England and here in America. And in his day, Charles Dickens was an absolute rock star. People lined up when he came. He toured America twice, came to Boston both times, and came to the North Shore too. And he read A Christmas Carol in Boston in 1867. People literally lined up for days. And what's
Mm.
really interesting about this is that it was people of all classes read Dickens. It wasn't just for the elite, it was for everyone. And in that story, as your listeners know, we have the poor family and the benevolence that Scrooge finally gets at the end when he realizes what Christmas really is, the true meaning, helping out the poor, less fortunate, Tiny Tim and his family, Bob Cratchit. And so what's interesting to me is he also did that reading at the Parker House.
Ah,
And I thought that was, a nice touch, just to
yeah,
know that, there's all these Boston connections and New
yeah.
England, I should say, connections. But it was really the New Yorkers that got us Santa Claus. I have to give them that credit.
Well, and we owe them a debt of gratitude then. Well, Ken, it's a fascinating narrative that you've put together, and I have to imagine, given the amount of time, the decades you've spent researching Christmas, that it has a personal meaning for you. And I'm guessing you had happy childhood experiences of Christmas. And I wonder, did your family have your own distinct traditions, and which one do you remember most fondly?
Well, that's I think we all do, and we all have our family traditions,
There you
and
are.
there I am. Yes, and there I am, and I still have that Santa Claus, that is on that fireplace. We're not going to talk about what decade that was, but
No.
and I will point out that you notice that that's a fig tree behind you. Those don't come in until after 1900. And I'm sure many of your listeners or viewers will remember those metallic trees from the 50s and 60s that become popular with the revolving lights.
Yeah.
But I will say that our traditions were pretty typical, except, I should say, in my talk, I talk a lot about a lot of our traditions are actually secular. It's
Yeah.
hard to, not talk about religion when you talk about Christmas, but there are some people that it was just secular. Santa Claus becomes secular. You don't think as much these days as Saint Nicholas. But with our family traditions, it might, when I was a little bit older than in that picture, include a midnight mass. And then coming back, a lot of our traditions, I'm Italian, had to do with eating. My favorite, and still to this day, my favorite meal of the year is Christmas Eve, because it was the 7 fishes.
Oh,
So this is what
yes.
I was referring to earlier. A lot of what survives from people's heritage is the, is the food waste. So for me, Christmas Eve was absolutely amazing. I was fortunate to have an amazing cook for a mother. And then, it also included, I keep the tradition. I'm the one that always has to cook the ricotta pie. I have my mother's recipe. So my memories are really centered around the food, because the other parts were really pretty much traditional, what we now call traditional: hanging of the stockings, the Christmas tree,
Right.
Santa Claus. My childhood, I grew up in the area, included, and I think many of your listeners or viewers would remember going to Jordan Marsh or Filene's to look at the windows. But my family always went to the Enchanted Village. It was part of our Christmas tradition. I loved it. My brother and I went. We got our pictures taken with Santa Claus, and it was great fun. And I'm happy to say that has actually been the Enchanted Village taken over by Jordan's Furniture, and it's open to the public. I don't know with COVID, but they've done a beautiful, beautiful restoration of it. And I just think it's still magic. I went a few years ago and I was just absolutely floored. So, yeah.
I've heard of, I didn't grow up in this area, so I've heard of the mythology of the Enchanted Village. Some year I must go to Jordan's and check it out. Ken, when I was growing up, my mother had a tradition on Christmas Eve. Her family was Irish in background, and we would turn the lights out in the house, light candles, and wander around the house, all the different floors, singing Christmas carols, which I enjoyed and which I assumed every other family in America was doing. And I think I was I think I was in high school before I realized, no, my mom just made it up. So I'm sure, probably lots of us have those homemade traditions, but it was a lovely tradition. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Well, speaking of Christmas evolving, let's talk a little bit about Christmas future. Any thoughts on the direction you think Christmas is taking now, or where we might wind up some years from now, assuming people have always done that?
Well, as I talk about, Christmas has, as you said, evolved and changed over the years. And some things, that I grew up with were thinking, were like forever, like Christmas seals. I don't see anymore, I think
Right.
I just don't see them. And I wonder, how many of your listeners or viewers, still do Christmas cards. I do too. I do regular Christmas cards, but I also use a service out of Britain, Jackie Lawson, for animated cards. And, so that, are we going to, are we still going to be doing Christmas cards in the future? I don't know.
Yeah.
And, there's been new traditions that came with technology. Let's not forget, the first Christmas movie was a silent, and it was under 5 minutes, and it was of A Christmas Carol. And, so there's now this tradition of Christmas movies, and I have my favorites. that I have to watch every year, and I'm sure your listeners
Yes.
and viewers have theirs. And if you want to watch them 24 hours a day on television, there are certain channels that you can do that with.
Yeah.
So, in the 21st century, to me, it's, what is going to develop? What is going to change? I'm not sure I can answer. I'm just an observer, and looking at, what's new, what's a fad. I mean, let's look at what's happened even before, COVID with online shopping. That had been cutting into sales, traditional sales for years. And, look at stores were opening on Thanksgiving. With COVID, that didn't happen. I think that's probably a really good thing, personally. And now we had Cyber Monday a few weeks ago, but it's not Cyber Monday anymore. It's Cyber Week, it's Cyber Month. So, is the traditional going to the stores going to fade away? I don't really know. I think people still, or at least I do. I'm not a big online shopper. I think people still want that contact and going out. And I think people will be very hungry to do that once we get through this pandemic.
Ken, I think next Christmas will be the biggest Christmas ever in terms of retail shopping, festival store windows, because we've all missed it so much from this year. Well, Ken, we're coming to the end of our time here. I know you're working on a book, and I think you have a couple of talks coming up in the near future. Why don't you tell us about those and how people can get information about them?
Sure. So I have, by the time this is broadcast, I think you'll have the opportunity to go to one or two. If you want to learn more, one is at the Florence Griswold Museum, which is in Connecticut, but you can just go to their website. That is this coming Sunday at 2:00. And then the following day, Monday at 6 p.m., I'm doing one for the Webb Dean Stevens House Museum in Wethersfield, Connecticut.
Great. So
if you're interested, those are, of course, all virtual, as everything is these days. So you're welcome to come and learn more. In terms of the book, there are some absolutely fabulous books out there. And I've quoted from one, Stephen Nissenbaum's The Battle for Christmas, which it's slightly academic, but it's a good read. And it's just chock full of just, fascinating information. But there are other good ones. There's a new one that came out that focuses on England more, but also America, and it's called Christmas: A History. Came out just a couple of years ago. So there's some really good books out there. So the book I'm working on, you mentioned, one of my other things is interpreting historic house museums. And I'm working with my co-editor on that book, Max von Bolgoy, on a book on interpreting Christmas at historic sites and museums. Wow. And the reason is, I think there's a real need for it because, as I told you in this talk today, in the 18th century, we didn't really celebrate Christmas here in New England. And a lot of historic house museums, and you may have some people out there listening from them, really want to decorate. But if they want to do it right, they shouldn't be. If they're doing the 19th century, that's a different story, and it depends on when. So I think there's a need for this. Hey, if you have an 18th century house and you want to do a decorator show house, I think that's great. That's fine. Just, that's not historically accurate, but that's okay. I enjoy pretty decorations as well as the next person. So yeah, we're working on that now, and I'm all geared up with these lectures to really sit down and move this forward.
Great. Well, Ken, it's been fascinating and so much fun to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming and educating us about the spirit of Christmas past. I really appreciate it. That's it for today, everybody. If you missed any part of today's show, it'll be available. It will show on tomorrow morning, Friday at 9 on Channel 9. It also will run again next Thursday, Christmas Eve, appropriately enough, at 9 on Channel 9. You can also catch it on Port Media's YouTube channel playlist for the morning show. Just go to www.ncmhub.org and click on the YouTube icon, then click on playlist and look for the morning show. Each show will also air on WJOP, that's FM 96.3, on Friday at 8 a.m. and then again the following Tuesday at 4 p.m. and Wednesday at 3 p.m. and will also be available as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Go to www.ncmhub.org and click on the cloud icon in the upper right-hand corner and then scroll down. Ken, thank you so much. Bye, everybody. Thanks for watching the morning
Thank you.
show. Bye-bye.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Happy everything, whatever you celebrate. Bye,
Bye.
everybody.